K-Rock invites you to free Frank Zappa.
In not releasing an album, they effectively keep me from earning a living by denying me access to the royalties from the albums and making it difficult for me to conduct a tour because there's no album to support the tour.
Our friend Frank has a great new 8-sided album called Leather. You've been hearing it here on the Rocks of L.A.
That's right, folks. Don't touch that dump.
Prince was by no means the first musician to publicly battle with his record label, let alone Warner Brothers. In 1977, Frank Zappa delivered the 4 remaining albums due to the company according to his contract. Here he is explaining it on the radio station K-Rock in 1977.
Warner Brothers does not have the rights to this material, although it was delivered to them, and they refused to pay me for the material. And so I claimed a breach of contract and set out to negotiate with some other record companies. And in several instances, Warner Brothers interfered with those negotiations and spoiled the possibility of releasing this material elsewhere.
According to the music lawyer Donald Passman, this led to record companies inserting a rule into contracts stating that an artist can't deliver a new album sooner than 6 months after the delivery of the prior album. Even worse, they said you can't start recording that new album until you've delivered the prior album. Fast forward 15 years. On September 4th, 1992, the Los Angeles Times broke the story that Prince had signed what some touted as the biggest recording contract in history, a 6-album recording and publishing contract reportedly worth $100 million with Warner Brothers. What could go wrong? Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm here to talk about Prince's critiques of the music industry in the context of Come and the early to mid-1990s. Let's get to it. You probably know that Warner Brothers released Come in August 94, squarely in the middle of Prince's very public protest against and contract dispute with Warner Brothers. He'd battled with Warner primarily over 2 issues. 1, its ownership of his master recordings, and 2, the label's unwillingness to match Prince's prolific creativity. Between January 93 and August 94, Prince wrote, recorded, and or produced these 5 albums, and wrote and recorded even more songs. Yes, Prince was prolific. He created an abundance of music. Wasn't that a good thing? And if it wasn't exactly a good thing, what was the problem, really? How could an abundance of music be a problem?
The problem they were having with Prince was that he was producing too many records too quickly, faster than their promotion and marketing machine could really digest, faster than the marketplace and the media could digest. We were in an era where most artists would release records anywhere from between 2 and 3 years apart, and he arguably could have had 2 records a year if he had wanted to. And he did want to. And of course, the legitimate argument was that radio wasn't prepared to accept that much product from any single artist either. And as a result, it made it difficult for the label to promote it. So there really was a legitimate argument to space things out. It just didn't fit him as an artist.
Leeds says 2 things there that I want to emphasize. First, in the 1990s, the music industry was still very much driven by radio. Singles on the radio led to the album, which led to the tour, which in turn reinforced the album. Record label marketing and publicity people had to work with radio. Secondly, Prince thought like an artist, not a commercial entertainer. For him, an abundance of creative material was a gift. It was a talent. We call that human capital. Remember that term. We're going to come back to it. So, to understand the problem, at least from the point of view of the record industry, we need to look more carefully at Prince's record contract. Following Janet Jackson's 3-record, $40 million deal in 1991, Madonna and Michael Jackson had each signed deals for $60 million respectively. CD sales were booming, and the general upturn in the economy meant the record industry was doing well, and Prince entered negotiations on the strength of Diamonds and Pearls, which had sold 5 million units, his biggest sales figure since Purple Rain.
He wanted the headline to be $100 million deal. And he became so fixated on waking up to see that headline in the newspapers that I could argue he didn't care how he got it. At least so it seemed.
The terms of Prince's contract were reported out this way. $10 million advance per album for 6 albums, 25% royalty rate, which is high, $20 million to restructure Paisley Park Records as a joint venture. I have questions about that. We'll come back to it. $20 million publishing deal with Warner Chappell, also a joint venture. Warner Chappell is the publishing arm of Warner Brothers. The crucial caveat is that each album advance was predicated on the previous album's sales. The previous album had to sell 5 million copies in order for Prince to get the $10 million advance. Then that album had to sell 5 million copies in order for Prince to get the next $10 million. This might sound great, but bear in mind everything you've just heard about the music industry, including that an artist typically couldn't deliver a new album sooner than 6 months after the delivery of the prior album. Now, I've never seen the actual contract that Prince signed, but again, this was standard for the time. It was also standard for record labels to require a term of X number of years in a contract. All of this contributed to Warner's wanting to limit Prince to 1 album per year. So let's think about the economics here, right? A month after signing the contract, Prince released the Love Symbol album. Despite considerable promotion, the album sold only, in quotes, 1 million units. To understand why this was a problem, let's try to responsibly speculate on how the finances might have broken down. I can't be 100% sure yet, but it's very likely that because Diamonds and Pearls sold over 5 million units, Prince received his first $10 million advance. But let's remember, an advance is an advance against royalties. The record company gives the artist a certain amount of money, and the artist doesn't get royalties until that amount is recouped by the record label. So Prince's gross royalties for Love Symbol would have probably been around, by my math, estimate, $2,475,000, but that's less than the $10 million advance. So aside from a floor amount of royalties, a minimum guarantee, Prince likely didn't receive much in royalties from that album. The 7.525 balance that he owed may have then been deducted from previous album sales or from publishing, what's called cross-collateralization. But wait, what about the way Diamonds and Pearls shook out? That was fair, right? Like, without going through all the math, I can tell you that if Prince was earning 25% on the wholesale price of a unit, which he wasn't at that time for Diamonds and Pearls, but if he had, then his gross royalties from that album may have been around $12,500,000, which is about 25% of the total sales minus manufacturing. But Warner Brothers' gross profit for the same album was likely around $38 million, approximately 75% of the total sales. So despite writing, recording, and producing a multi-platinum album with at least 3 radio hits and several music videos, Prince was still earning a quarter on every dollar. It's not as though Prince didn't already understand that capitalism extracts profit by exploiting labor. But I think he quickly saw that even a so-called superstar mega deal had nothing to do with fairness or equality or freedom.
I think, like most artists, they don't really investigate until it's happening to them. And I think that's pretty much what Prince found himself doing, is examining more closely. Like, well, how does this work? Prince is astute, man. He likes to read and share ideas. So the more he got into the literature about the music business, the more upset he got, you know, and how it's designed. I mean, it's systemic. That's what it does. You exploit an artist, and they get paid a mere pittance compared to what you make.
That's Michael Bland, Prince's drummer in the New Power Generation at this time. When he says systemic in that video, I interpret him to imply, or at least I hear the echo of, the systemic racism that's central to American society, including the music industry. You might remember from my talk about the Rainbow Children a couple years ago that Billie Holiday recalled in her memoir, Lady Sings the Blues, how she only got paid, quote, $30 for making half a dozen sides, 6 song recordings, when her own manager, John Hammond, paired her with band leader Teddy Wilson. That means no royalties, just $30. And that's only one example in a long, long history. But Bland's point here goes one step further. Like so many aspects of systemic racism, the exploitation of labor, though designed, is taken for granted, overlooked, or explained as just the way things are. They're in the realm of racial capitalism, a term coined by South African scholars in the 1970s who questioned what would happen to capitalism there when apartheid ended. In other words, as Robin D.G. Kelly points out, could capitalism survive without apartheid, or did it too need to be dismantled? Cedric Robinson is responsible for developing the concept in his 1983 book, Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition, when he argued that historically capitalism and its exploitation of labor have depended on racialism and vice versa. In other words, how those in power fundamentally differentiate between groups of people for the sake of profit. Here's the geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore to explain it.
The foundations of racial capitalism, the foundations of the social organization of human groupings in Western Europe during the rise of capitalism. They don't have anything to do with Africa, Asia, North America, or South America. They have to do with what was happening here in Europe between people, all of whose descendants might have become white. I mean, that is the major lesson of racial capitalism. And why does that matter? It matters because capitalism won't stop being racial capitalism if all the white people disappear from the story. Capitalism requires inequality, and racism enshrines it.
Capitalism requires inequality, and racism enshrines it. In other words, for the few to possess vast amounts of profit, resources, capital, the majority must possess less, much less. Since the founding of the United States, white supremacy has provided the narrative that enshrines inequality as just or as natural. To enshrine means, of course, to preserve as if sacred. And it's the sacredness that tricks the white working class and the middle class into thinking that they're not being exploited by capitalism. So we might ask, was Prince a victim of this racial capitalism? Of course he was, but this victimization, this oppression, is baked into every aspect of commerce and industry. I mean, record contracts, including his, probably have more in common with sharecropping contracts than any other kind of contract. You don't get a fair share of the profit, you borrow to stay afloat, hoping for a bigger payday, and thus you only dig yourself deeper. Let's talk finally about the problem of abundance. Prince was prolific, but in the logic of capitalism, which is to say racial capitalism, abundance can create a surplus of product that lowers the economic value that can be extracted from it. This was why Warner Brothers wasn't going to release the 4 albums Frank Zappa delivered to them all at once, and why it wasn't going to release 4 Prince albums in a year, whether or not that was Prince's attempt to get out of his contract sooner. It wasn't just the marketing and the radio, it was a belief that a kind of scarcity was needed in order to protect the profit the label could extract from Prince's labor. However, this logic depends at least somewhat on the wide profit margins we've already discussed. In the mid-90s, a CD cost about $1 to manufacture, partly because all the major record labels owned their own pressing plants. Yet by 1995, the labels were wholesaling CDs to record stores for $11 per disc, and most CDs, most new ones at least, were retailing for around $17. So these contractual arrangements benefited not just one corporation like Warner Brothers, but an entire ecosystem of corporations that included some of these record stores. So let's return to the concept of human capital. This ungainly term describes the knowledge, talents, traits, skills, and training acquired by a worker over time that are useful for production and profit. In theory, increased human capital is rewarded by higher profit for the capitalist and for the worker, but in practice, that's not always the case. Prince is a good example of how and why that happens. Prince's prolificacy, that is a real word, was one aspect of his human capital. It was a talent. but the high quality of it was the result also of years of hard work, from taking those music business classes in junior high to watching videotaped recordings of every live show. Prince's work ethic was off the charts. In a sense, he'd done everything right. He followed all the rules of capitalism. But from his point of view, and let me be clear, I agreed with him then and I agree with him now, he was not being rewarded fairly for his increasing knowledge or skills, such as owning and operating his own recording studio, which probably saved Warner Brothers about $1 million per Prince album. In theory, you own your human capital. No one can take it away from you. The idea is that you can take it elsewhere if your current employer doesn't value it. But if this ecosystem of corporations is fundamentally exploitive, if every table in the casino is rigged, then what choice did Prince really have? So I maintain that one lesson Prince had learned from his so-called crossover years in the mid-'80s was that he shouldn't have to keep trying to make every single album appeal to a pop audience. In other words, an audience that included white folks. It was limiting. It was probably exhausting. And again, Prince saw himself as an artist, not an entertainer who would cater to every trend. Maybe he was just experimenting in the mid-'90s, but I think it's obvious that the MPG albums were for a different group of fans, that The Undertaker was a niche project for a certain group of fans, and so forth. That's what his abundance meant. You could get 5 albums instead of 1, and each one could be marketed in a specific way to a specific group of folks. Shouldn't that marketable prolificacy in some be enough to make someone their money? This applied not only to Prince's primary albums, but also the albums he produced and released through Paisley Park Studios. Here again is Alan Leeds.
It was a constant struggle to get any kind of major attention from the promotion and marketing people at Warner's. They wanted to be supportive, but they didn't really believe in the product. The fact is we were giving them what those in the industry call difficult records, meaning they weren't easy to promote and market to radio, which at that time was the only way you knew how to promote a record, was to go to radio. They kind of had their heads in the sand as to any kind of alternative means of promoting and marketing, which was always a source of frustration to artists and producers. And to me as a label head, it was as well, because I said, you know, we've got some viable product here that people who find it really like it. It has a place in the market somewhere. So how do we get it to that place? And if we have to bypass the normal route of going directly to urban radio or pop radio, whatever these formats are, then isn't it our job to figure out the detour in order to reach that public? But the labels just weren't prepared to do that because they were on kind of automatic pilot. They had enough product to feed the machine, so they didn't have either the time or the energy to do anything that was the least bit creative or off-center.
That's their fault. That's not our fault. I mean, you know, if their machine can't keep up with us, what are we supposed to do? What's he supposed to do? You know, he got to get his music out. I mean, within reason, if the material is good, it should be marketed, it should be put out. They should do videos for it. They should be able to go on tour, and they should be able to have support and, you know, do the things that they're supposed to do and have a successful record. Record company gets paid, they get paid.
So I want to leave you with a few final questions. But first, I want to say it's painful to watch that segment about the so-called difficult records and see George Clinton, a funk legend who Prince was trying to lift up. Were Clinton's record or Mavis Staples' record from Paisley Park Records considered difficult because they were black and over the age of 50? What does it mean for a record label to not believe in an album? Terms pop and urban radio signify in the 90s or now. Finally, although some view the mid-90s as an awkward or even embarrassing time for Prince because of the name change, the so-called death of Prince, or just the public nature of his dispute with Warner, of course writing slavery on his cheek, I recommend we look at those years as a massive expansion of Prince's class consciousness. His tactics, such as the name change, as grounded in histories of black liberation, and his general strategy as one of problem solving. If his abundance of artistry was a so-called problem, he was the only one trying to solve it. And that would lead him to the next chapter, the Gold Experience and Exodus.
This, the dawning of a new spiritual revolution.